Hello everyone, welcome to the Chess Hobbit channel. We are going through the series Endgame Basics. We are covering Rook Endgames. Today we'll be going through a series of studies by Cheron from 1900s. This primarily deals with Rook and Pawn versus Rook, with the Pawn on the 4th rank. Yeah. With that, let's get started. So this is the starting position. White has a king on c3, pawn on c4, rook on d1. Black has king on e6 and rook on h8. You can notice that white has cut off the black king on the d file, so black king cannot get any closer. And if black tries to, for example, exchange his rooks, let's say rook h7, rook d7, it's a little tricky because he has to do it in a manner where he does not allow the white king to come in front of the pawn and get an opposition. So it's not an easy position. So this is the starting position. Now we'll start with black's move in this position. Right. So how should black defend this? We studied the pawn on the 7th rank, which is the Lucena position. We studied pawn on the 6th rank and the 5th rank. One of the key things when we studied all this is that we recognized that, for example, in the rook and pawn on the 6th rank, we recognized that the rook should be at least 4 files away in total from the pawn, so that it's in a checking distance from the king. The same principle we're going to apply here as well. Okay. So the main defensive idea here is for black to play rook c8, and we'll understand why this is important, right? So what is white's threat here? White's going to push the pawn c5. Black king can't get any closer, and then he's going to improve his king position, king c4, king b5, and then if black tries to check here, he's going to come king c6, king b6, and then king c7, and then he's going to run out of checks, and then he's going to push the pawn to c6. And you can already notice that if the pawn gets to the 6th rank, the rook is cutting off the king, and also the king is on the long side, which is lost. The king should be on the short side. That is white's plan. So white's plan is to push c5. So the simplest way here is to stop c5. We just do that by playing rook c8. Now white does not get c5 easily. If he moves the rook to support the pawn, eventually he's going to lose control of this d file, and black is going to get his king closer, get his king to c7 or c6, and eventually that's going to be a draw. So how can white proceed here? Let's say if white tries to get his king closer to the pawn, king d4 is not possible because of rook d8 check. He loses the rook. So let's say king b4, rook b8 check, you go king a5 or king c5. Let's say king c5, rook c8 check, king b5, rook b8 check, king c6, rook c8. Now you see the problem, right? The white king has to move back and support this pawn. So he's just one rank short. Let's say if the pawn was on c5, then it would have been 1. He would play king b6, rook b8, king c7, and it would be 1. Right? So that's the main idea. That's the main defensive idea that black has. So white cannot just walk his king. Here, because the key thing here is the black rook is at least total of 3 ranks, including the rook's rank, 8th rank. It's 4 ranks away from this pawn, right? Because of that, just the formation we already know that if the rook is like 4 files away, if you are checking from the ranks from the pawn, if it's 4 files away from the pawn, then it's in the right checking distance. The defensive side is able to secure a draw. Similarly here, the same formation, it's just the board is turned 90 degrees. So the rook is 4 ranks away from this pawn. Therefore, the king is not able to zigzag and attack the rook right? And at the same time defend this pawn. So that is black's defensive idea here. So what can white do here? We already saw that king b4 isn't working. Of course, you can't push c5. The rook moves away from the d file. Black is just going to get the king closer to c6 or c7. Then it's a draw. So the only other possibility here is, let's say if white plays a move like, let's say, rook d4. So we need to understand what is white's idea. If we ask ourselves, right, it's easy to then figure it out. So now white king is now threatening to zigzag and come all the way when black checks here. Now the difference is this pawn is supported by the rook, which means, for example, if let's say, for example, if let's say black plays king e7, king b4, rook check, king c5, rook check, king b5, rook check, king c6, rook check. Now white can just go king b7 because the pawn is supported here, right? If black plays, let's say, rook c5, now king b6 again, now rook c8, now c5. So white has managed to use his king, zigzag, attack the rook and push the pawn. It's only possible because the rook is able to support this pawn on c4. So that is his idea, right? So let's go back for a moment. So we were here. Let's go back. So if black understands this intent, then it's easy to defend, right? Now this rook is the piece which is supporting c4, right? So the simplest way for black to draw is just playing king e5. Black's idea is to make sure that this rook is attacked by the king. So king b4 is not possible now because the rook is lost. If the rook moves back, black will just play king e6, right? We are same back to the starting position. There's no difference here, right? So that isn't working. And let's say if white plays rook d5 check, black goes king e6. Now again, because this rook is supported by this pawn, even though white may get king b4, king c5, etc., right? When he checks, c4 pawn is still undefended. So there is no way for white to win this. Let's say king b4, rook b8 check. Now king c5, it's simple, just check again, right? And there is no way out. Let's say we go back king d4. Now white can't make progress. Again, for example, even black can make a move like rook h8. The idea is simple. He's just stopping c5. c5, then rook check, and this rook is lost. So white cannot make progress. And if the rook moves this way, king d6 is coming. And if the king moves back to c5, black's gonna check here. So there is no progress that white can make. That's the main idea. So let's say king b4, rook b8. If he blocks with rook b5, then just go back, rook c8. Yes, white has been able to achieve c5, but please note that white also had to give up the d file. So therefore, let's say if white plays a move like c5, black can just play king d7, and this is a simple draw. And he gets to c7 or c6, and there is no way that white can progress. Or if white tries to, let's say, play rook b7, trying to cut off the king and secure, next his threat is c5, then black can just play king d6, and then he reaches, let's say, king b5, now rook c5 check. The point is, if king b6, then this pawn is lost. If king b4, then black can reach this square quite easily, right? So now he can just go back rook c8. Now he's just threatening king c6. Of course, cannot play king c6 because rook c7, king c7, king c5, and white gains the opposition. So he can just play rook c8, and there is no way that white's able to make progress here. So that's the main idea. So let's go back to the starting position. This is the starting position. So we looked at rook c8, which is the main way that Cheron had studied, given in a study. We call this as frontal attack. We attack the pawn from the front of the pawn. So it's called as frontal attack. So whenever we have a pawn which is at least 4 ranks away from the rook, right? So then a frontal attack is a good way, right? Though here the white rook is cutting off the black king, a frontal attack is a very good way to hold back white's pawn, because the 4 rank distance is able to give black the right amount of distance to keep checking the white king and without allowing him to progress. Okay? So just to complete analysis here, there are other ways to draw as well. So what we'll do is we're gonna look at some of those as part of the future positions. Okay? So now let's go to a slight variation of this position. So what's the difference between the position here and the position we already had earlier? The main difference is black's king position. Earlier it was the king was on e5 or e6. Now the king is on e4. So how does it make a difference? There are a couple of things you will notice, right? One is, of course, white can check here, push the king to the f file, thereby gaining 2 files cut off, which is definitely a possibility. Or the other thing which we will discuss in detail here is what we call as a rank cutoff. So you can notice that in addition to cutting off the king, the black king on the d file, white can also cut off the black king, for example, either on the 5th rank or on the 6th rank, for example, on the 6th rank. So which actually proves to be a much easier way for white to realize his advantage, and we will see how, right? So let's say in this position, let's evaluate, let's take one of them first. Let's take rook d5 first. So what is white's idea, right? White's idea is simple. He's gonna move his rook along the 5th rank, move it away from the king attacking it, and then he's gonna play c5, and then he's gonna follow up with king c4, right? And then, for example, he'll move his rook to the 6th rank, right? Once the pawn is on c5 and king is on c4, move the rook to the 6th rank, push c6 because the rook supports it, and then the king will move to c5. In this manner, he's going to get closer to the rook, and then eventually the king can break out through, let's say, b6, c7, b7, and he's going to win this position. So that is his idea, and this is one of the most effective ways to convert the advantage, right? So rook d6 is equally good. Let's first initially look at rook d5. Let's say black plays rook b8. White can just play, let's say, rook h5, moving it as far away from the king. Let's say rook d8 or rook c8, for example. Rook d8 because now c5, rook d5 is a possibility, right? So if it's, for example, rook c8, then white just plays c5. There's nothing much black can do. I'm just going to play king c4, and then in this manner, then next I can play rook h6, c6, king b6, and king c5, and eventually I break out king b6, king b7. So let's say black plays rook d8, trying to counter c5 with rook d5, for example. you can see that rook d5, king d5, king b4, king c6, king c4 is a draw. So here white has a simple option. You can just play rook h4 check. You can see that the rook has blocked the king. He can't go back to d5, so he still has to stay on the 5th rank. Of course, king e3 is lost because white can just play king c4 and then push the pawn. King e5, same problem, king c4. Black king still can't get to the d file, so he has to first move the rook. Let's say rook d1. Now you see that white has achieved pushing the pawn to c5, and the king is going to go to b5 now. So why is this winning? You'll see here. Let's just make a couple of moves and then it will become very evident. King d5, rook h5, king e6, king c6. This is almost like a pawn on the 6th rank position. Let's say king e7, king c7. Let's say rook check, king b6, rook d1, c6, check, king c7. White can pretty much force this position, and this is lost for black for the simple reason that we already studied. When the pawn is on the 6th rank, the king has to be on the short side. For example, if the king is on a7 and the rook is on the long side, let's say on b1 or a1, for example. Now the rook is here, so let's say on b1, which is 4 files away, then it would be a draw. Unfortunately, here the king is on the long side and the rook is on the short side, so this position is lost. I'm not going to go into detail. We've seen this in the other video. So this position is lost. So this is one of the simplest and most effective ways to convert an advantage, and we call this as a rank cutoff. We saw rook d5. There is another way to achieve the same thing as well, right, which is rook d6. What is the idea here? The idea is very simple. It's the same rank cutoff. Instead of the 5th rank, I'm cutting off on the 6th rank. Let's say king e5. White can just play, for example, a move like rook b6. Here he has to be a little precise, and I'll explain why, right? Rook b6. The idea is now white is just going to play moves like something like king b4 next, right? And then eventually he's going to push this pawn, and there's nothing much that black can do. Let's say if he breaks out with a move like, for example, rook h8, c5, now if black plays king d5, white has king b4. Now white's threat is rook d6 check, and there is nothing much that black can do about it, right? So if rook b4 check, he's just going to go king b4, rook h4 check, then he's just going to go king b5, and rook d6 is coming. Let's say he goes back rook d6 to stop the check. White can just continue to improve his position, king b5, and eventually black will run out of moves, and then and white is able to achieve the position that he wants. Let's just make a couple of moves here. Let's say if he plays rook d7, if the rook moves here, he's just going to give rook d6 check and then rook d1, and then it's lost. So let's say rook d7, we'll play rook b8. Black is out of moves here because the rook cannot move on the d file. If the king moves, then white is getting king c6, and then it's simply lost. Or the king moves, even c6 is simply win. So this is the idea. Now white has to be precise here. Rook b6 was important because he was able to go king b4 without having to worry about rook b8 check. Let's say, for example, white plays, earlier we saw rook d5, rook h5, right? Let's say if white plays rook h6. This is a mistake because black will just play rook b8, and white has no easy way to progress. If he plays c5, for example, black will play king d5. If you notice the difference, right, the white king is cut off. The white king is not able to come in and support this pawn. That's the main difference here. And now if the white king has to progress, white has to bring his rook to b5, and when he does that, the black king breaks the cutoff on the 6th rank. He's able to go king d6 and king c6. So this will be drawn. So white has to be very precise here. So rook d6, king e5, rook b6, and now not only is he cutting off the black king on the 6th rank, but also he is threatening king b4, and there is no way for black to check here, right? So that's the difference. So with this, we looked at two ways, rook d5 and rook d6, but the principle behind them is the same, which is we cut off the black king along the rank, and then we use the rook also to shelter the king, and eventually we make progress via king b4, and then it becomes difficult for black to prevent c5, king c4, and then white improving the position further. Yeah. So this is called as a rank cutoff. Now let's go to the next position. So what's the difference in this position? You notice that white rook has cut off the black king at a distance of 2 files from the pawn. Earlier the rook was on d1 and the king was on e5 or e6, but now we have 2 files between the black king and the white pawn, the d and the e file. So now can white take advantage of it? That's what we're going to see here, right? The simplest way for white to realize his advantages, king b4. We already saw black's going to give frontal checks. King, let's say king c5, rook c8, king b5, rook b8, king a6, rook c8. It's pretty much forced so far. Now white plays rook c1. So this is the difference between the king being on e5 and on f5. So rook c1. Now let's say if the black king was on e5, if it's just one file cut off, he can just play a move like, for example, king d6, and then it's a simple draw, right? And then he's able to get to c7. Let's say king b6, then rook check, and eventually king gets to c7, and it's a draw. But black king is just one square too far away. Let's say if he plays king e6, king b7, so he can play king b7. It's simple enough, attacking the rook. Now rook c5, then king b6, and then c5, right? So now what does he do? King d7 is not possible because rook d1 check is winning. So if the rook moves away, then he just gets c5, c6. So rook c5, now king b6. Again, white wants to get king b6 and c5, but he's doing it with a tempo. Rook c8. Now c5 is winning. The same reason, right? King d7 doesn't work because white can just check, move the king away, and push the pawn further. There's nothing that black can do here. Let's say rook b8, king c7, let's say rook h8, just c6. This is a simple win. If let's say rook h7 check, just king, you can move, let's say king b8, and then rook check, then king b7, and then there's no stopping c7 and c8. So this is the simplest way. So this is the simplest way to win in this position, where because you have 2 files cut off, white has the time to bring the king to a6, force rook c8, and then play rook c1, and when the king tries to come nearer, just attack this rook, gain a tempo, and push the pawn. So that's the simplest way to win here. Now let's look at a different variation of this. So we notice that it's pretty much the same position, but the entire set of pieces have been shifted by one file to the right. So that's the difference here, right? So now let's understand how white can win this position, right? If, for example, if he tries the same method which we looked at earlier, let's say king d4, rook d8, let's say king c5, rook e8, king d5, rook check, king here, rook e8. Now there is a difference here. There is a very subtle difference here. If he plays rook e1, now black can hold this position, and I'll explain how, right? Let's say king g6. We looked at king c7, so in this position king d7. The main difference here is, please note, just because the pawn has shifted by one file, now the black king is on the short side, and all black has to do is to take his rook to the long side, rook a8, and we know this is a draw. So even if the pawn goes further, right, this is a draw. We know that because black is just going to keep checking. Rook a7, and there is no easy way to hide, right? He has to come all the way down, and then the king goes back here, right? So this black keeps checking here. So so we notice that in the starting position, the same plan which we applied earlier, and the pawn was on d4 and king was on d3 and rook was on f1, that does not apply here, because the black king is already on the short side, right? And the black rook can go to the long side. So white has to come with a different idea. So what do you observe in this position which white can take advantage of? Yeah, that's right. So it's the black's king position. So black king is on the last file, which means white can generate mating threats against the king. For example, if he goes king e4, king e5, and black keeps checking, perhaps he can go king f5 or king f6, even be willing to give up this pawn if he's threatening mate. Let's say king is on h6, he can go king f6, and black cannot take this pawn because let's say rook h1 is mate, right? So that's the extra possibility that white has in his hand. So now let's understand how should white continue so that he can really make use of it, right? Let's say if he plays directly, if he plays king d4, rook check, king here, rook check, king f5, there is no point because he's not getting closer to the rook. Black is just gonna check here, then he'll continue checking. There is no point, and king f6, then he'll take the pawn and there is no mate. So this doesn't work. So if you observe a little closer, so we want to force the king ideally to go to h6, because then we can get the king to e5, rook e8 check, king f6. Now rook e4 is not possible because rook check is mate, and then if he does something else, then I can either push e5 or get closer to the rook. So how do we push the king to h6? So if we carefully examine, if it were black's move, what can he do? If it were black's move, he cannot move his rook. If he moves the rook away from the e file, I'll just push e5 and then king e4, and white makes progress. That's the purpose of rook being here. He's trying to hold this pawn. If the rook moves closer, let's say rook e7, then the rook is just three ranks away from the pawn. So now white can go king d4, king e5, king d5, king e6, and he can attack the rook because the rook is little closer than what he should be, right, on the 8th rank. So which means pretty much black cannot move the rook. Black can only move the king. So black king has 2 moves. If he goes to h6, we've achieved our goal. Then we can walk the king all the way to e5, rook check, king f6 is winning. So, but he also has a square h4. So let's see what do we do here, right? So let's say for example white plays rook g2. We already evaluated that black's rook moves are not possible. King h6 is lost because white can just play king f4 or king d4, king e5, check check check, then king e5, check, king f6, and then there is a mate threat here, and then white wins. Okay. So if let's say check again, and then king e7, and then e5, and it's lost. So but black has this move king h4, which is forced because king h6 is lost. Now what can white do here? For example, can he try some tactical possibilities with something like e5 now, right? The idea is rook e5, then king f4. White is attacking the rook. At the same time, he's threatening rook h2 mate. It looks great, but the problem is e5, rook e5, king f4. Black has this move king h3. If he takes the rook, I'm going to take the rook. If rook g3 check, I can just go back, let's say king h4, or just king h2 is a draw. King h4 is not, I'm sorry, so king h2 is the most precise. King h4 is not correct. So king h4, then he'll be in trouble. Now again, white can just move, let's say rook g1, and it's lost. Right, so king h2 is the most precise. Get out of the mating threats, and then now it's a draw. So what do we do here? We force the king to h4. Now there is a possibility with e5. The problem is rook e5, king f4, then king h3. Because the rook is on g2, king h3 is a possibility. Now still black cannot move this rook if white continues to wait. So can we gain a move here, right? For example, can we achieve the same position with rook on g1 and then try to push e5, right? That's what we're going to look at. Let's say where else can white wait? If rook g1, then black is going to just go back king h5. So let's look at other squares. Again, rook g6 is going to go king h5 with the tempo, so you don't have time for e5 and all that. So the only square left is rook g7, which is the most logical. What does black do? Black has to go king h5, because if he goes king h3, we studied something earlier, right, which is rook g5 is the simplest way to win, because we know that the rank cutoff is very effective, right? Now we are cutting off along this rank, and it's going to be quite simple to win from here, right? So let's go back. So black is forced to play king h5. Now play rook g1. See, we achieved the same position, but instead of rook g2, we have the rook on g1. So now king h6 is still lost, because king goes to e5 and then check king f6. But here the problem is black doesn't have a choice of playing king f4, because now e5 is lost. With rook e5, king f4. Now threat is rook h1, and the rook is also lost, attacked here, and king h3 is not an option because the rook is at a safe distance in rook and g1. So which means black is forced to go king h6, king d4, or king f4, equally good. Rook check, otherwise white's going to push e5, king e5, rook check, king f6. Now white has two threats, rook h1 as well as e5. So let's say if he plays rook f8 check, king e7. Now the rook has to move, and white will achieve e5, and then it's a simple win, right? So this is something which is a unique solution that we need to understand. So when we see that the pawn is on the e file, and let's say especially two files cut off and the king is on the last file, it could also be, let's say the pawn is on the d file, and let's say the black king is on h5, that's equally possible. Now we cannot go for the option with the king going to c6 and rook coming to e1 because the king is on the short side and the rook will go to the wrong side, long side. So the only way here is to make white has to take advantage of the black king position and then force him to h6 and then get the king to f6 with the tempo. So that's what we saw. We'll look at one more variation of this position, and then that should give us a good understanding of how to play against rook and pawn on the fourth rank. So what's different in this position? We are looking at a b pawn, right? And white has a two file cutoff. This can be the same. For example, you can have a mirror image with white having a pawn on g4, king on g3, rook on e1, and black king, let's say, on d6 or d5, and black rook on g8, right? So pretty much the same, right? The same principles apply. So can white win this position? We already know when there is a two file cutoff, the main winning plan for white is, let me get some water. Excuse me. The main winning plan for white is, we saw earlier that white would like to take his king, white would like to take his king, let's say a4, b5, c6, etc. Ideally, I would like to have another file here so I can move away if there is a check, and when the rook attacks back, then I can put the rook behind the pawn, and then eventually white king gets to the rook closer. I mean, black doesn't have time to come here, right? But if you notice here, white doesn't have that extra file here because he is on the b file already. The pawn is on the b file. He can go to the a file, and black keeps checking. He doesn't have an extra file to the left of the a file, so he has to use only the a and b files. So for example, if he plays king a4, rook a8 check, king b5, rook b8 check, let's say king c5, then check again. There's no more squares, right? So he has to come back here. Let's say rook check. Let's say he comes here, rook check. Same thing, he can't go to the d file either because he's losing the rook. So king b6, then rook b8 check. So this is important to recognize. If we go back to the starting position, white does not have an extra file to take advantage of the two file cutoff here. So that's the main difference in this position. So let's see if let's look at different tries for white. Let's say white plays move like rook d4. Idea is simple. I'm going to support this pawn, so I'm going to walk now all the way. So even if you keep checking, I can get closer to the rook because this pawn is defended. So the natural move is we need to attack the rook. It's very logical. Now if the rook moves, let's say to d7, we're just going to keep attacking the rook, right? And if he tries a rank cutoff, the problem is black is just in time to get back here. King d6, and let's say king c4 or king a4, it doesn't matter, just play king c6. Black is perfectly safe here. He got to c6, right? So let's look at alternatives here, right? So let's say white plays king c3. White doesn't want to give up control of b4. He doesn't want to give up control of the file here, right? At the same time, he also doesn't want he doesn't want to give up the control of the file here, and at the same time he also doesn't want to lose the option to blockade a check with rook c4. So he's keeping as many options open. So what can black do here? So if you notice closely, right, the king has moved away from here, so which means now king cannot come to a4. He has to waste two moves to come to a4 if he has to come there, right? So Black has a couple of different ways here. I think the simplest way in my opinion is just go to h8 or g8 and excuse me, so go to h8 or g8 for example, and I think I would prefer h8 because it's further away, but g8 is still the same. Now, can white make progress? For example, if he plays b5, right, the most dangerous move he has to consider is b5, right, because that's what white has been trying to do here, right? So let's see what happens with b5. Now he can come back this way. Now he can start checking back, right? For example, he's just in time, rook c8 check. Now if he goes king d3, let's first look at rook c4, then rook c4, king c4, king d6 is a draw. We know this, right? So let's say he plays king d3. Now what is his idea? White's idea is he wants to eventually push the pawn as further as possible, and then when he's trying to break out the rook, then and try to bring the king closer without allowing the king. So but there's a lot of ways in which black can draw this. He can play king e6 for example. He can just play, let's say for example, rook h8 because it's still a long side check, but I think the simplest in my opinion is king e6. How can white progress? Because rook c4 is still not an option. He'll exchange and play king d6. Basically black is cutting off the white king from getting to support the pawn, and if white is trying to exchange the rooks, then it's a draw. That's the idea. Let's say if he gets something like b6. Now this is simple. He just plays rook b8, rook b4, can play king d6 or king d5, doesn't matter. He's going to go to c6 and take the pawn. So this is a draw as well, right? So going back here, right, so rook h8 is the simplest option. The main reason being, if white gets b5, black is going to play rook check and either force rook c4 or force the king away from the pawn, and white cannot make progress, right? So let's say for example white continues to play a move like rook d1. Now again we know that this pawn is not supported anymore, so you can just give rook check, king b3, rook b8. White cannot make progress. So that's the main issue here. Yeah. So this position is a draw. So it's important that black plays precisely here, right, in this position. I think the most white can get is a move like rook d4, threatening king a4, king b5, etc. But then black should not allow time. Play king e5, king c3, and then rook h8, which is the simplest way to achieve a draw. So there's also another way here. He can play rook c8 check. The same idea, right? If he comes king d3, we already saw this. He can just play king e6, right? We saw this with the pawn on b5, but it's the same thing, because now if he gets rook c4, what happens here? White doesn't have to take the rook because king c4 is winning, but you can play king d7, and this is a draw. Let's say rook c8, king c8, king c4. It looks like white may get a distant opposition, but the reality is he doesn't. Black can just play a move like, for example, king b8. The point is, if white comes king c5, can come king c7, king b5, then king b7, and it's a draw. So this is a draw. This needs to be looked at precisely. So this is another way as well, right? So he can play rook c8 check. So king d3 isn't working. Let's say if white plays rook c4, rook b8. The point is, white still cannot push b5 and make progress, and neither can he play king c4. For example, if the king was on b3 in this position, white can play something like rook c6 and king d5, rook a6 and king a4, and he can win here. But the problem is the king is one square too far away to get to a4. Let's say rook c6, king d5, rook a6. White does have a rank cutoff, but unfortunately the king is not on b3, king is on c3. So which gives an extra possibility for black. Rook check, king b3, rook c6. So black is able to break the rank cutoff. If you take, then king takes, then it's a draw. King c4 or king a4, then king b6 is a draw. Right? If the rook moves, then black king just makes its way behind. So for example, rook a7, trying to cut off here. Black can just play, for example, rook c1. Threat is king c6. There's nothing that white can do about it. Let's say rook a6, go back rook c6. So this position is a draw. So this is another plan, right? So just so that this is achievable only because the king is on c3, right? If the king were on, for example, in the same position, if the king were on b3, it's a little slow. The king were on b3. For example, if in this position the king were on b3, then rook c6 is winning, because you don't have time for rook c8 and rook c6 maneuver. That's the difference. Yeah, so we looked at two different ways. King c3. Now black can play either rook h8 in this position, and try to check here, or he can play rook c8 directly, and then when he plays rook c4, then go back rook b8, and for rook c6, king d5, rook a6, and then try to get the rook c8 and c6 to the 6th rank and offer an exchange. So this position is a draw. So we looked at a different set of positions. We looked at initially the pawn on the 4th rank with one file cut off, and the simplest way for black to draw is to do a frontal attack on the pawn and not allow it to move further, and keep the king on the squares either on the 5th or the 6th rank, right? And then we saw that the rank cutoff is a very powerful way or effective way for the attacking side, the side with the extra pawn, to win. In this, for example, in this case, if the king is on e4 or e3, right? So then the cutoff on the 5th or the 6th rank is a very, very effective way to win. Then we also saw how to win with two file cutoff, right? Especially with the d pawn, where the king can go zigzag its way all the way to the 6th rank, and then eventually when the rook attacks the pawn, bring the rook behind the pawn, and then when the king tries to come closer, then white king attacks the rook, gains a tempo, and then eventually gets the pawn to the 5th rank, and the black king is caught on the wrong side, on the long side of where in fact he should have been on the short side. And we also looked at the e pawn with a two file cutoff on the g file. In this case, the only way to win is take advantage of the black king on the last file, and then try to bring the king ahead, and then when the rook checks, use the opportunity to move like king f6 with black king on h6, so that you can threaten mate here on the h file, at the same time threaten e file. And then finally, if it's a b or a g pawn, even a two file cutoff, if black plays precisely, is still a draw, because white does not have an extra file to walk his king away and then eventually bring the rook behind. So those are some of the key conclusions. I hope this was useful. If you have any thoughts or feedback, please share in your comments. And if you would like me to cover any specific positions, games, topics, I would love to do that. Just send me an email or include it in your comments. Thank you and have a wonderful day.